Hello, and today we're going to talk about the fall of Rome and the supposed, or the debated, lead poisoning factor that is thought to possibly have contributed to poor decision-making, decadency, and just neglect within the Roman patricians, within the Roman elite. That was a huge factor into the empire falling. So this essay on this website is just talking about the theory, the debate, and kind of on both sides, people who argued for and against the lead poisoning theory. Now, one of the things they did find was that there was lead in the piping used for their water. Sheets of lead were also used to line the channels of Roman aqueducts. Here's a quote from Vitruvius, who wrote during the time of Augustus, and he explained that water conducted through earthen pipes is more wholesome than that through lead. Indeed, that conveyed in lead must be injurious, because from it white lead is obtained, and this is said to be injurious to the human system. They knew that there was some problems associated with lead. And it's just bringing up the arguments and what they're talking about from a historical perspective and archaeologically. But then we get into the amount of lead in those pipes was determined to probably not nearly be enough for chronic lead poisoning. Even though it seems like there was a lot, you're still dealing with like really, really small trace amounts, and they say that it probably wasn't. But rather than encrusted lead pipes, the probable cause of chronic lead poisoning was the consumption of defrutum and sapa, which was a syrup derived from grapes. They didn't really have sugar or honey in large quantities, so they boiled grapes into being syrup, and that's what they used as a sweetener. But the problem with their defrutum, their syrup, was that some people put the must in leaden vessels, and by boiling reduce it by quarters, others by a third. They recommend the lead vessel, and we chemicists have learned that when you mix sugar and lead, it creates something called lead acetate, and it's basically just like makes like a very sweet tasting thing. Even though it's still really bad, they ultimately conclude that even though they were boiling this like widely used grape syrup with lead vessels, they still came to the conclusion that it wasn't enough for the chronic lead poisonings. Here's another article. This one has a video and writing about it, about all the same stuff basically, and trying to figure out why they were acting so crazy, and seeing if there was a possible explanation from lead poisoning as well. Again, ultimately, the research does not show that there was enough lead to be the main antagonist of Rome in causing the fall of Rome. Here, we can take a look at lead poisoning and kind of see some of the symptoms. This is just some radiology website. Lead poisoning, so it can lead to pica, which is eating things that are not nutritious, like nails or glass or weird things like that. So it has a pretty damaging array of symptoms. There's just all these neurological, gastrointestinal, renal, hematologic, musculoskeletal, the endocrine. Leads to huge amounts of damage, and it leads to a lot of bone damage. And this is a result of pica, people eating, or someone ate a screw. Hopefully to not sound confusing, these aren't Roman radiological pictures, but this is just relevant to see kind of what lead poisoning does and what it looks like. Most of the symptoms are coming in the form of internal processes. We have like cognitive issues. We have some like anorexia, anemia. There's gum and teeth issues that come from it as well, and like the paleness associated with anemia perhaps. And then depending on if it's in children or not, the effects may look a bit worse. So it's important to keep in mind what lead poisoning can do. You just look up pictures so you can see the different sorts of damage it does to the body. And then this is some archaeological remains where they have found there were some people with lead poisoning. It certainly was an issue to an extent for some people. The whole idea that it was for the patricians is still contested, but they did find lead in some of their kitchenware and their pipes. And obviously, when you do that, you ingest it and can various types of issues, such as the different lead poisoning symptoms. Again, if you just want to read up on it, we can find it pretty easily. On top of that, they were quite the wine drinkers, especially with the patricians. They drink a lot of wine. I think the numbers are probably debated to some extent, but they know they drank a lot, and their wine was stronger, but they watered it down. But they also had like probably what would be several glasses to a couple bottles. In many cases, that on a daily basis. And they had a lot of associations with their culture. It was super important. It would be like cocaine within our politicians today. And it was an important part of their religious, their social, their just day-to-day things. It was just something you did. You drank wine, and often sweetened with their defrutum that did contain some of the trace amounts of lead. Again, no conclusive evidence to say that it was enough for this widespread, like, cognitive, decadent issues that destroyed Rome. And this is Nicander's Alexipharmaca, where he talks about various different like diseases and stuff. And I believe this is the first mention we have from Roman writing that we possess that talks about lead poisoning. In the second place, consider the hateful brew compounded with gleaming, deadly white lead, whose fresh color is like milk which foams all over you when you milk it, rich in the springtime into the deep pails. Over the victim's jaws and in the grooves of the gums is plastered an astringent froth, and the furrow of the tongue turns rough on either side, and the depth of your throat grows somewhat dry, and from the pernicious venom follows a dry retching and hawking, for this is severe. Meanwhile, his spirit sickens, and he is worn out with mortal suffering. His body, too, grows chill, while sometimes his eyes behold strange illusions, or else he drowses. Nor can he bestir his limbs as heretofore, and he succumbs to overmastering fatigue. So that was the description of what they called Saturnism. That was the term they used for it, because lead in alchemical spheres is called, or is dominated or ruled over by Saturn. Lead is a white metal, and Saturn's associated with bones. Lead poisoning is more of a bone disease, and so there's all these like kind of alchemical sort of on that like astrological side, and the fact that this is, Saturn was one of their chief gods. This disease was important in that context. Saturnism. Here's again is given the earliest description of acute lead poisoning, is again the one we just read, who speaks of a gleaming, deadly white lead, whose fresh color is like milk which foams all over. The poet describes a frothing mouth, asperity of the tongue, and dry throat, together with dry retching, chills, delusions, and overwhelming fatigue. But if lead poisoning had been endemic, it presumably would have been remarked upon at the time. This is the essayist writing. And yet there is no mention of the fact until early in the 7th century AD, when Paul of Aegina, a Byzantine physician, described chronic lead poisoning, although he does not associate its symptoms with the disease. I am of the opinion that the colic affection which now prevails is occasioned by such humours, the disease having taken its rise in the country of Italy, but raging also in many other regions of the Roman Empire, like a pestilential contagion, which in many cases terminates in epilepsy, but in others in paralysis of the extremities, while the sensibility of them is preserved, and sometimes both these afflictions attacking together. So that's kind of a lot of the description on lead poisoning, also known as plumism and also known as Saturnism, because of its association with the metal, with the whiteness, the white frothiness described around the mouth, and the qualities of Saturn and the fatigue and the bone relationship and all that kind of stuff. So oftentimes the diseases are more kind of the idea and the attributes of a god or of a metal or of a disease. Sometimes more so than the actual symptoms. Is you get the feeling that you're melancholic, that you're tired, and therefore you're associated to a specific god, planet, disease, metal. In alchemy, all of those things were interrelated because they were trying to figure out what was going on. That was just the way the practice worked. Again, here's more lead poisoning, just so you can understand the physical symptoms: joint and muscle pain, headache, belly pain, blood pressure, trouble concentrating, memory problems, mood changes, low fertility, miscarriage, headaches, feeling tired, looking pale, metallic taste in the mouth, trouble concentrating, constipation, all those kinds of things. Missing, interestingly enough, is the most characteristic attribute of Saturnism described by Nicander, and what the literature in the vernacular says about Saturnism, and that is the quality of whiteness that affects the person. The astringent froth over the gums, the furrow of the tongue turns rough on either side, the dryness, the association of lead poisoning, I believe, has been focused too much on lead and not enough on a sort of companion disease of lead and other toxic metals, which does not require the toxicity of the heavy metals to be symptomatic. What I mean is, there's this other disease you can have that you only really need small amounts of lead or any other toxic metal, but obviously for this example we're talking about lead, that you only need small amounts of lead for it to then become very dangerous and very debilitating. Enough that if there was a group of people, a large group of people that were the decision makers, the politicians, the elite of an empire, that it would lead them to poor decision making, decadency, and whatnot that we saw, the odd, erratic behavior of the Roman elite during its fall. And it's also an issue that is exacerbated by heavy drinking. And that is very underrated, understudied disease. Well, it's a fungus that can lead to disease that we all have, or that most humans have, called Candida. And toxic heavy metals build up in you, allow for Candida to become rampant in your body. Normally, Candida yeast is just another part of your microbiome. It doesn't do anything bad to you unless you start to accrue different types of metals. As you can see, lead, silver, mercury, all the metals that are associated with toxicity is mainly toxic because of what they allow to happen in your body, which is the overgrowth of Candida yeast. And again, they're not good or bad, but when you start to destroy your immune system, they, being an opportunistic fungus, can lead to some very serious diseases. And perhaps most interestingly, the white frothiness, the Saturnism, all of the symptoms of lead poisoning can be said about yeast, Candida yeast overgrowth. And I would imagine that the study of lead poisoning and Candida have hardly been done at the same time, in the same context of each other. Meaning, I think anytime you have lead poisoning, you will have Candida or some other opportunistic species or subspecies of yeast. You will have that, I think, 100% of the time. Though you can have Candida outside of lead poisoning. But if you want to see what Candida looks like, it's that frothiness of the mouth, of the tongue that was described, and the gums. It causes all sorts of similar gum infections. I'm sorry if this is nasty, but this is a very common symptom. I'll go out of it. If we can learn the various symptoms of Candida, I think we have a better grasp on how it was possible that there was a lot of disease going on in the Roman patricians. It doesn't have to be directly lead poisoning. There was enough toxic heavy metals in their diet and enough alcohol, which leads to diet high in sugar, high alcohol intake, and weakened immune system. When alcohol is the culprit, symptoms will likely be experienced in the mouth, esophagus, and throat area. This was that dry throat they're talking about, the frothiness of the tongue, the foul smell, all those kinds of things is more said of Candida than of lead poisoning. Having that kind of white tongue is not really a symptom, as we could see through all the radiology and stuff and all the different articles about it. Is less of a lead poisoning issue, and it is more of a yeast infection of the Candida overgrowth. Candida is a common type of yeast that's found everywhere. Various forms of Candida live on your skin and in certain parts of your body. Sometimes the yeast can grow out of control and cause minor infections in specific parts of your body, including thrush and different sorts of yeast infections. But if Candida gets into your bloodstream, it causes candidemia, one of the most common healthcare associated infections. Severe untreated candidemia can lead to invasive candidemia, which affects internal organs. And again, all of the symptoms are the same thing, basically. As with most diseases, you can have symptoms in pretty much, certainly from the Roman perspective, they did not have x-rays, so I don't think that they were calling lead poisoning or Saturnism. They were referring to the quality of whiteness of you from the bones. I think it was, they were noticing the yeast infections mainly around the mouth, since that's what is described in the writers in the literature. But let's continue to see. Candida's infection can reach brain and impair memory. Anytime you have anything that can do that, you're going to have anomalies and lots of different kinds of mental illnesses and diseases that are going to be outside even the range of what's clinically accepted. But it can affect the brain. It's able to pass the blood-brain barrier. Can lead to all sorts of like Alzheimer's, and there's just a lot of... They're discovering more and more that Candida is behind a lot of what we think of as more inevitable or more common household diseases. Because Candida is so opportunistic, even if you get sick from something else, you're likely then going to have enough damage to your body that the Candida will start to spread to different parts of you. Heavy metals are a lot more of an issue. It's not like the only problems that come from lead poisoning is once you hit like this threshold to where then you have plumism or Saturnism. You will have problems at much lower amounts, especially if you are doing other dietary habits that can exacerbate that. How heavy metal, toxins, and Candida fuel each other as an ongoing problem. Like living organisms on our planet, yeast species like Candida do interesting things to improve their survival. The really interesting thing here is that Candida will actually transform heavy metals in our body to nanoparticles, which are less threatening or harmful to the Candida itself. Additionally, this allows the Candida to bind to the metal particles and pull them out of circulation to further reduce the threat of the metals to the Candida. Unbelievable, but proven in the research is that Candida can reduce both toxic metals, such as mercury, lead, and copper, aluminum, and nickel, as well as precious metals, such as gold or silver, to nanoparticles. Studies have actually shown that Candida cells are able to regulate and bind to different metals in different ways in order to allow them to adapt and survive in a variety of habitats, whether that's in our body or out in the environment. Now, the reason why that's an issue is because this allows them to pass through different parts of the body. Candidiasis and candidemia is usually confined to certain areas of your body. When you have toxic metals, those nanoparticles allow it to travel to every other part of your body, and we're not fully even comprehending or understanding the full range of effects it can have. Cognitive, motor skills, behavior, certainly not over a lifetime, as likely could have been the case with the Roman elite. Another thing I think worth thinking about is if a large number of the Roman elite were suffering from Saturnism. If we understand Saturnism to be Candida, then it then certainly becomes possible that they suffered from this. And I think the thing with a lot of fungal infections is that it compounds your lifestyle and your issues. If you're becoming decadent, or it is the reason we associate something with decadent, is because you become filthy in your inside and out, your microbiome is disturbed, and it leads you to that lethargy, to forming weird dietary habits like only wanting to consume alcohol and very sugary sweetness, sweetened drinks and foods. And it seems like we know that both of those factors, toxic metals and high alcohol and sugary alcohol diets, in the extent that they consume that stuff, will lead to Candida, and that Candida can lead to every sort of issue that you would have thought to have been associated with the Roman elite. Because I think the consensus is the erratic behavior was not like mentally stable people. Now, you could probably argue some Roman emperors may have been doing what they did as a statement, or just because they didn't care. I don't know, but I think the consensus is that they definitely could have been going through something poisonous or toxic, but there's that dissonance between the evidence they found was not conclusive of lead poisoning, but you still have the fact of they became very decadent. They started to live in squalor. They didn't take care of themselves, and Rome fell shortly after. Right, the hierarchy broke down in Rome, and it broke down the same time these people were acting crazy. I think the Saturnism is describing Candida, and I think at least it's worth looking into. If we're not looking for Candida, and this is true even for today, if you're not looking for Candida, if you don't know to look for Candida, I should say, you're not going to find it, and you're not going to think that it's even an issue when it's an underlying issue behind probably a majority of the most common and the most serious illnesses, because it is opportunistic and lives in almost every single human. And it would have even during the time of the Romans. I think the connection to Saturnism is strong because of the nature of it. And maybe this is just coincidence or synchronicity, whatever you want to call it. The word Candida comes from the Latin Candida toga, which was the white togas worn by the elites of the Roman, those like classic ones. It literally Candida just means white, and it was to signify their honesty in their role as public office. And then Candida, the Candida fungus was named just because of its quality. It usually just leads to white symptoms. So that's and I guess that's just a coincidental connection. The fungus was named, I think, in the 1800s, but it's almost like too coincidental that the choice of clothing by the Roman elite is the name of the fungus that perhaps brought about their fall. It's at least one of those moments where you accidentally name something after something else that is related to it. At least that's my thought anyways. I think it's worth pursuing. I obviously don't have inconclusive evidence. I'm not there looking through the remains and stuff, but I do think it's worth pursuing. If there are historians who are in that position, you should check out Candida and see if you can find any evidence. I know they cremated a lot of the emperors, and I think a lot of the patricians in general, And I'm wondering too that there was a reason they did that, and that they were starting to look really bad. They probably smelled bad. They probably were starting to get deformed. If you look at candidiasis, can lead to a lot of different problems. You would not want your elite to look so sickly and gross. So I think they just got rid of the bodies as the best way, because there's an interesting quality of pretty much any fungal infection, and I would argue that and this is either like an ancestral kind of thing or a neurological effect of the fungus that it does as a defense mechanism. But there seems to be a huge amount of shame when it comes to fungal infections, and if you have one, the last thing you do is tell people about it, or you don't acknowledge that you have it. You want to ignore it. You don't want to go to a doctor. You don't want to tell anyone. It's, for some reason, one of the most embarrassing things to have, even if it's the most minor fungal infection. And that's interesting because, and I did this for the Bible, it was a religious issue. It was shameful to have a fungal infection. It meant you were unholy, you did some sin. And we see that time and time again throughout different civilizations. They had all these sorts of skin problems and health problems. They didn't know what was causing it. And it usually ends up being fungus, now that we know how fungus works and how present and prevalent it is in our bodies and in our environments and ecosystems. And for the Romans, I believe, to name this vague, frothy, white disease Saturnism is showing that religious connotation to a disease, that there was some misalignment with the gods and the metal, which would still be a correct attribution to it, probably led to it in a more subtle way than they believed. The reason why lead poisoning wasn't described is because most of them didn't have lead poisoning. They had candidas. They had Candida in its many different forms, and that very well could have led to the fall of Rome. And they hid that. They didn't talk about it. You didn't have writers writing about it because there's that shame quality to it. You didn't want your patricians to know, especially in how religious and superstitious the Romans were, that they all had Saturnism. It would have meant that that they weren't doing what the gods wanted. I think that would have discouraged the dynamic between the citizens and the elite. If a religious population believed its patricians, its elite, were unclean, unholy, they were decadent and negligent of their own bodies and stuff, you would have a lot of issues. So I think they tried to cover it up. They cremated the bodies. They don't really have anyone writing about it. But yet we can see the decadent behavior and lifestyles that these later Roman emperors lived, and then the rapid decline of their empire and their values. And that goes hand in hand with just infections and stuff like that. People with healthy microbiomes tend to not get involved in that, but these things are as neurological as they are skin, physical, and gut and bone problems. And that part is downplayed oftentimes in fungal infections, is the neurological component to it. But the other angle I was trying to look for was if Italian people had some higher propensity for Candida, but I think it's probably too far removed from the Roman times, and also there's so little studies, even globally, on Candida and through genetic studies or ancestral dietary studies to come to any conclusion. Maybe there's still merit in pursuing that, but in this map showing completed country estimates of fungal diseases, and there's even like you can see, America didn't even participate in this study, which was trying to see the burden of fungal diseases. Even today, we aren't acknowledging it, and we are not even fully understanding this extremely symbiotic and opportunistic fungus, and it leads to the decline of your body and mind and soul, if you think of it in the religious connotation as well. Though I will say there was a couple of studies of Candida and Candidemia that was that was done by Italian researchers. So maybe there is more a higher propensity or awareness of it that could indicate that historically they had a huge problem with that right around the fall of Rome, and we just won't have the data on that unless you're looking for that specifically, and if you have other countries do it as well, and you just check the genetic kind of factor, right? The physiological factor to it. Real quickly, just because this is all about Candida and we're still facing it every day, our current elite, if you want to think of it that way, they're not making the same mistake that the Romans did, in that they are not poisoning themselves, but they are poisoning the citizens instead. Our water, our food, our air, our houses, materials, paint, lead, all those kinds of things is leading to heavy metal buildup and other microplastics and stuff like that. And this allows for Candida and other pathogenic fungus to bind to and allow them to disrupt our health and body. And it's super difficult to find, and the medical industry is so far behind fungal studies, at least that it treats, that it diagnoses. So we are being poisoned by the elite instead of the elite poisoning themselves. They learned microbiology this time around. But apparently coconut oil is super good at killing Candida. And there's different ways you can apply it on your skin. You can eat it, mix it in with food, cook it. And it is noteworthy that coconut oil was active against species of Candida, 100% concentration compared to fluconazole, which is like the standard medical grade antifungal. So that could be a good option, just so that that's there, because if you don't learn history, you're doomed to repeat it, right? And I think that there could be merit to considering Candida in the fall of Rome. Certainly you should consider the microbiome, now that we kind of know about it in any historical context, evolutionary, biological context now. It really adds a new component to everything going on. It makes it a lot more complex. But that is, I think, it for the video. We could go on and on about this stuff, but we'll leave it at that. Thanks for watching, and peace out.